The envelope trembled slightly in my hands, heavier than it should have been, as if it carried not just paper, but the full weight of everything left unsaid between my grandmother and me. The cream-colored stationery, stamped with the neat, looping script of Margaret Anderson, lay untouched for nearly an hour on the kitchen table, while James Carter sat across from me, nursing a second cup of black coffee and stealing glances in my direction. Outside, Richmond wore its late spring gloom like a shroud, the clouds hanging low and heavy, and in that dim, suffocating light, every decision seemed sharper, every regret deeper. "I can leave you alone if you want," James offered quietly, his voice barely louder than the ticking of the old wall clock. I shook my head, fingers tightening around the edges of the envelope. She wanted me to open it today. I've waited long enough. The seal cracked with a brittle snap, and inside, folded with precise care, was a single sheet of thick paper and a key. An old, worn thing, small enough to lose in a coat pocket, but heavy enough to change the course of my life. James leaned forward, curiosity flickering across his face. "What is that? A house key?" I turned it over in my palm, the metal cool and oddly comforting. "It looks antique. Definitely not for anything modern." My heart raced as I unfolded the letter, my grandmother's familiar handwriting washing over me like a tide I hadn't realized I missed so desperately. "My dearest Claire, if you are reading this, then everything has happened as I feared it might. Your parents have chosen sides, and Vanessa has won. But what none of them know is that I have been watching, and I have made my own arrangements." The words blurred for a moment as tears welled up, unbidden and sharp, the grief I had been carefully fencing in for the past month surging forward. I blinked them away, forcing myself to continue reading. "This key opens the lockbox registered under my name at First Commonwealth Bank on Broad Street. Go alone. What you find there will change everything." I lowered the letter slowly, my mind racing faster than my heartbeat. Change everything? What could Grandma possibly have hidden away? James watched me intently, concern etched into the lines of his face. "Claire, what did she say?" My mouth was dry, but somehow I found the words. She left me something only I meant to find. Saying it out loud made it real, made the air around us hum with a nervous kind of hope I hadn't dared to feel in weeks. I brushed my thumb over the key again, feeling the faint ridges and scratches worn into its surface. It was beautiful in its own way, like an artifact of a different life, a different version of me that might have existed if things had gone differently. I remembered the last time I had seen Grandma Margaret, propped up against hospital pillows, her voice thin but still filled with an iron strength. She had taken my hand then, squeezed it tighter than I thought possible, and whispered, "Your time will come, Claire. They won't see you, but I do." A lump formed in my throat, too thick to swallow. I glanced at James, who gave me a small, encouraging nod, as if to say, "Whatever this is, you don't have to face it alone." But some journeys, some reckonings, could only be faced alone. "I need to go to the bank," I said, pushing back from the table, the chair scraping softly against the worn hardwood floor. I tucked the letter carefully back into the envelope, slipping the key into my pocket where it rested heavily against my hip, a constant reminder that maybe, just maybe, everything wasn't over yet. As I grabbed my coat and headed for the door, James called after me, "Be careful, Claire, and whatever you find, remember it's yours, not theirs." I paused for just a heartbeat on the threshold, the weight of his words settling deep into my bones. Then I stepped out into the gray, misty afternoon, the key in my pocket, the hope in my chest, and the storm of change waiting just beyond the horizon. The ballroom shimmered under 1,000 crystal lights, every inch dripping in luxury, every guest adorned in designer fabrics and practiced smiles, and yet, standing at the edge of the room in my modest navy dress, I had never felt smaller. Vanessa was in her element, gliding effortlessly between groups of our parents' wealthy friends, laughter sparkling from her lips like champagne bubbles. Peter trailed behind her, his hand never straying far from her waist, his polished smile firmly in place. I clutched my glass of water tighter, the condensation making it slip slightly in my hand. James had offered to come with me tonight, but I'd refused. Some humiliations were better witnessed by no one. I watched as my father climbed the small platform at the center of the room, tapping his glass with a fork. Conversations dimmed to murmurs, then to silence. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," he began, his voice strong, steady, brimming with pride. "This evening isn't just about celebrating another successful year for Anderson Financial Group. It's about the future. It's about legacy." I felt a pit form in my stomach even before the words left his mouth. Effective immediately, he continued, glancing fondly at Vanessa and Peter. "My daughter Vanessa Anderson Roberts and her husband Peter Roberts will assume the roles of co-presidents of Anderson Financial Group. Margaret and I will remain as advisors during the transition, but the future of the company now rests in their capable hands." Applause erupted, polite and effusive. I clapped too, because what else could I do? The polite facade was expected, even demanded. Vanessa accepted the congratulations with perfect poise, her hand fluttering to her heart in mock humility. She looked radiant under the chandeliers, a goddess anointed, while I stood half-shrouded in the shadows like an afterthought. As the noise subsided, Vanessa took the microphone, her tone breezy, yet calculated. "And to clarify," she said, smiling sweetly, "since Peter and I will be leading the company, it only makes sense that when the time comes, we will inherit it entirely. It would be impractical to split ownership with someone not involved in the business." My blood turned to ice. The words rang in my ears long after the microphone was passed away. Not involved? As if my entire career in healthcare, my decision to forge my own path, somehow made me less worthy, less family. I caught my mother's eye across the room. She gave me a small, tight smile, the kind reserved for strangers or inconvenient acquaintances. Not a mother watching her younger daughter being publicly erased. I set my glass down, my hands trembling too much to hold it any longer. The room spun slightly, the chandeliers blurring into a smear of cold, indifferent light. I needed air. I needed to breathe, but there was no escape from the thick, cloying reality of what had just been done. As the evening wore on, I drifted like a ghost among the guests, exchanging hollow pleasantries with people who barely remembered my name. Somewhere between the silent auction for exotic vacations and the endless refills of wine, I overheard snatches of conversation. Vanessa's plans for expanding the company, Peter's speech about modernizing leadership, my father's booming laughter as he toasted to the next generation of Anderson's success. Not once did anyone mention me. Later, as I stood by the terrace doors trying to summon the courage to leave, Vanessa appeared beside me, the ever-graceful hostess. "Claire," she breathed, air-kissing my cheeks with an effortless flick of her hair. "I'm so glad you came. It means a lot to the family, really. Family." The word felt like a slap. "Lovely dress," she added with a slight smirk, her eyes flickering to the outdated tag still hidden beneath my sleeve. "Vintage is so in these days." I smiled tightly, my fingernails digging into my palm. It wasn't vintage. It was last year's clearance rack, bought when I'd barely scraped enough after paying my student loans and hospital rent. But explaining that to Vanessa would have been like trying to explain color to someone born blind. The night dragged on, each moment another stitch in the growing tapestry of betrayal, until finally, mercifully, I slipped away through the service doors, stepping into the cool Richmond night alone. As I walked the empty streets back to my car, my heels clicking hollowly against the pavement, I realized something with startling clarity. I was no longer a part of their future, but maybe, just maybe, I was about to rewrite my own. The apartment was dark when I got home, save for the soft glow of the streetlights seeping through the blinds. I dropped my keys into the bowl by the door with a hollow clink and leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of the evening settle onto my shoulders like a shroud. It wasn't just about losing a company I was never allowed to be part of. It was about being erased, discarded like an old photograph no one wanted to display anymore. I kicked off my heels and padded barefoot into the kitchen. The silence, so loud it made my ears ring. My phone buzzed once. James. I stared at the screen without answering, sinking into one of the worn chairs at the small kitchen table. The same table where Grandma Margaret used to sit, spinning stories about strength and dignity, about standing tall even when the world tried to bend you. Somewhere along the line, I had stopped believing those stories applied to me. I poured myself a glass of water, my hands trembling slightly, and stared at the worn oak tabletop. Images from the evening flashed through my mind like cruel film reels. Vanessa's triumphant smile, my father's pride, my mother's polite indifference. I wasn't even an afterthought. I was nothing. An inconvenience too stubborn to fade gracefully. The tears came then, hot, angry, humiliated tears, not because I had expected anything different, but because some small, stupid part of me had still hoped. When the sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, I wiped my face with the sleeve of my dress and forced myself to sit up straighter. Enough. Enough crying over people who had made their choice long before tonight. Enough waiting for crumbs of affection from a table where I was never truly welcome. The next morning, the sky was gray again, a low, drizzling rain painting the streets slick and empty. I met James at a small diner 2 blocks from my apartment, the kind of place that smelled of burnt coffee and fried eggs, with a vinyl booth stuck to the backs of your legs in the summer. James was already there, a cup of coffee in front of him, a book spread open but forgotten. "You look like hell," he said softly as I slid into the booth across from him. "Feel like it," I muttered, stirring a spoon aimlessly through the black coffee the waitress plunked in front of me without asking. James waited until the waitress wandered off before leaning in. "Claire, you don't have to pretend with me. What happened last night?" I laughed, the sound brittle and sharp. "They made it official. Vanessa and Peter get everything. The company, the house, the legacy. I get memories, I guess." I shrugged, trying to play it off, but James wasn't fooled. "You don't deserve this," he said fiercely, his hands tightening into fists on the table. "You've done everything right. You've built a life, a career. You've given everything to that family, and they treat you like I'm disposable," I finished for him, my voice cracking despite myself. James exhaled slowly, struggling for words. Finally, he said, "You're not. You never were." I stared down at the swirling black surface of my coffee, wanting to believe him, but the years of being overlooked, passed over, dismissed, they weighed heavier than any words could lift. "Maybe I should just accept it," I said quietly. "Maybe this is just how it is." James shook his head. "No. You deserve more, Claire, and you're stronger than you think." His conviction burned bright, but it was the memory of Grandma Margaret's voice that stirred something inside me. "Your time will come, Claire. They won't see you, but I do." I straightened slightly, a flicker of something fierce and stubborn, igniting in my chest. I didn't know what the key in my pocket would unlock, but maybe, just maybe, it was the door to something bigger than the life they had allowed me to have. James caught the change in my posture and smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "There she is," he said, tapping the side of his mug. For the first time in weeks, I managed a small, real smile back. It didn't erase the hurt. It didn't erase the betrayal. But it reminded me I was still here. I was still standing. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as powerless as they thought. The First Commonwealth Bank on Broad Street looked exactly the same as it had 20 years ago when Grandma Margaret used to bring me along to deposit checks, solid, imposing, with brass fixtures and heavy oak doors that seemed designed to intimidate. I paused outside for a moment, the key burning a hole in my pocket, my heart hammering against my ribs like a prisoner desperate to escape. It felt surreal, as if I were about to walk into a different life and leave the old Claire behind on the sidewalk. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and old money. A young woman in a neat navy suit approached, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "Good morning," she said with a professional smile. "How may I help you?" I fished out the envelope, now slightly worn from constant handling, and unfolded the small note bearing the safe deposit box number. "I'm here to access a lockbox registered under Margaret Anderson." The woman's smile flickered slightly at the name, as if it meant something, or maybe I was just imagining it. She nodded and motioned for me to follow her. Down a narrow hallway lined with portraits of serious men and stern-faced women, we reached a small, private room. She handed me a clipboard. "Please sign here. You'll have complete privacy once inside." Her tone was kind but brisk, as if she knew that whatever waited behind that steel door was no ordinary errand. The lock clicked open with a soft metallic snick, and she pulled out a long, slender box, setting it gently on the table. "Take all the time you need," she said, before retreating quietly, leaving me alone with the weight of the unknown. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the box, afraid to open it, afraid of what it might mean if hope was misplaced, but also afraid of what it would mean if it wasn't. Finally, with hands that trembled despite myself, I lifted the lid. Inside was a thick folder bound in deep burgundy leather, and beneath it a smaller, velvet pouch tied with a faded gold ribbon. I reached for the pouch first, my fingers brushing over the soft fabric, and untied it with slow, deliberate care. A single key fell into my hand, not like the first one, but heavy, ornate, with the name Anderson Building etched into its side. I stared at it, uncomprehending, my breath caught somewhere between a sob and a gasp. Beneath the pouch, tucked into the folder, was a handwritten letter in Grandma's neat, looping script. "Dearest Claire, if you are holding this, it means the time has come for you to know the truth. You have always been the one I trusted to carry our true legacy. The Anderson Building, the heart of our family's labor, the foundation of everything we built, was never meant to be surrendered to ambition or arrogance. It is yours now, my darling, entirely yours. No conditions, no apologies, no need to seek their permission." I read the words again and again, my mind struggling to catch up. The Anderson Building was mine, not part of the Anderson Financial Group, not tied up in corporate entanglements or petty family drama. Tears blurred the ink on the page as I read the next lines. "And there is more, Claire. Inside the folder are documents establishing a trust fund in your name, designed to ensure that you have both the means and the freedom to live your life on your own terms. You are not beholden to their approval or their acceptance. You never were." I pressed the letter to my chest, my whole body shaking with the enormity of it. The validation, the love that had lived quietly behind every moment Grandma Margaret had ever spent with me. She had seen me. She had believed in me when no one else did. I opened the folder next, scanning the neatly organized documents. Property deeds, trust certificates, letters of instruction. Legal terms blurred into insignificance against the roar of hope flooding my veins. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future wasn't a locked room with Vanessa holding the key. It was a wide open door, and I had the right, no, the obligation to walk through it. I stood slowly, the key clutched tight in my hand, the folder pressed against my side, feeling a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. Grandma hadn't just left me assets. She had left me a weapon, a chance to rewrite the ending they had already written for me, and I intended to use it. The days that followed passed in a strange, heightened silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to decide what kind of woman I was going to become. I went to work at the hospital as usual, moving through my shifts with steady hands and careful smiles. But something inside me had shifted, tectonic and irreversible. At night, I sat at my tiny kitchen table, poring over the documents from the lockbox, learning every clause, every term, every right Grandma Margaret had secured for me. James noticed the change before I even said a word. One evening, after a long shift, he stopped by with takeout and found me surrounded by papers and open books, highlighters scattered like fallen soldiers across the table. "Claire," he said, leaning against the doorway, a container of lo mein forgotten in his hands. "You're planning something." I looked up at him, meeting his eyes without hesitation for the first time in what felt like years. "I'm not just planning," I said, quietly. "I'm preparing." He didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. James knew better than anyone the kind of battles I was used to fighting. The silent wars where the only weapons were patience and endurance. But this time, I had something more powerful. I started visiting lawyers during my lunch breaks, sitting across mahogany desks and discussing trust structures, property law, business succession rights. I learned about forensic accounting, about leverage, about the ways power could be quietly, legally, unassailably shifted. I met with an independent financial advisor, someone Grandma had quietly arranged years ago, a woman named Diane who smiled knowingly when I introduced myself. "Margaret said you'd come when you were ready," she said, sliding a thick portfolio across the table. Ready. I wasn't sure if I was ready, but I was willing. Evenings blurred into nights as I built my plan piece by careful piece, each document another stone laid in the path toward reclaiming what should never have been taken. I wasn't driven by revenge, not really. I was driven by the quiet, aching need to be seen, to matter, to prove that erasing me from their plans didn't erase me from existence. Sometimes doubt crept in during the long hours after midnight, whispering that maybe this was foolish, maybe I should let it go. But then I would picture Vanessa's triumphant smile, my mother's indifferent nod, my father's cold, proud speech, and the fire inside me would flare hotter than before. Grandma had trusted me, not just to survive, but to thrive. One Friday night, as a spring storm lashed rain against my windows, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, studying my reflection. And for the first time, I didn't see the invisible daughter, the forgotten sister. I saw a woman forged by disappointment, but not destroyed by it. A woman who could walk into any room and demand her place, without apology. I changed little things first, straightened my posture, lowered my voice, looked people directly in the eye. At work, patients and colleagues alike responded without even knowing why, a slight deference, a sharper respect. James noticed too. Over dinner one night, he grinned and raised his beer bottle in a mock toast. To the woman who's finally stepping into the light, he said. I smiled, clinking my glass against his. It's about time. Outside, Richmond buzzed with the hum of life. Cars splashing through wet streets, distant music from a rooftop bar drifting on the breeze. But inside me, there was a quieter, deeper music playing, a rising anthem of something long dormant, now fully awake. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't reckless. I was waiting, sharpening, becoming. Because soon, very soon, the Anderson family was going to learn that the daughter they had pushed aside, the sister they had dismissed, wasn't just back. She had never left. And this time, I was ready. The conference room at Anderson Financial Group was a study in understated power. Dark wood paneling, thick carpet muffling footsteps, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a sweeping view of Richmond's skyline. I sat at the long polished table, folder in front of me, hands folded neatly, calm on the outside, a storm on the inside. Across from me sat my parents, Margaret and Harold Anderson, as poised as ever. Vanessa and Peter occupied the seats to their right. Vanessa in a crisp white suit that screamed victory. Peter with his ever-predictable smirk barely hidden behind polite indifference. Walter Simmons, the family's long-trusted attorney, cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming, he began formally, though his eyes flickered with something like curiosity as they glanced at me. Perhaps he sensed, as I did, that today would not unfold the way they expected. My father spoke first, his voice smooth but clipped. Claire, we understand you requested this meeting. We're here out of courtesy. But let's be clear, the decisions regarding succession have already been made. I offered a polite smile, the kind Grandma Margaret had perfected, sweet, serene, and utterly impenetrable. I appreciate your time, I said evenly, but I believe there are some facts you're unaware of, and some decisions that remain very much open. Vanessa let out a soft, derisive laugh, leaning back in her chair. Claire, this isn't personal. It's just business. Funny, I said quietly, unfolding the documents from my folder, because it's about to become very personal. I slid the first sheet across the table, a notarized deed of ownership. My father frowned, picking it up, scanning quickly, then slower, his face paling by degrees. The Anderson building, I said, keeping my voice measured, is not, and has never been, an asset of Anderson Financial Group. It was held separately under the Margaret Anderson Trust, and upon her passing, full ownership transferred to me. The silence that followed was almost tangible, thick and electric. Peter recovered first, scoffing lightly. Fine. You own the building. Congratulations. It doesn't change the company's structure. I smiled faintly, sliding the second document forward. Actually, it does. The trust fund Grandma Margaret established also includes a substantial stake in Anderson Financial Group, enough to grant me 50% ownership rights. Walter leaned forward slightly, adjusting his glasses as he examined the paperwork. I caught the flicker of realization and something close to respect in his eyes. My mother's voice, when it came, was tight with disbelief. Why? Why would she do this? Maybe because she saw something in me you refused to see, I said, my tone soft but unyielding. Maybe because she believed legacy wasn't just about bloodlines or obedience, but about character. Vanessa's face flushed deep red. This is absurd, she snapped. Grandma was old, confused, manipulated. Margaret Anderson was of sound mind when she executed these documents. Walter interjected, his voice cutting clean through Vanessa's protest. There is extensive documentation to support that. I leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch, watching the pieces shift and fall inside their minds. The realization that the daughter they had overlooked, the sister they had dismissed, now stood between them and the future they thought was guaranteed. You have two options, I said finally, my voice calm but carrying a weight none of them could ignore. You can buy out my share at a fair market value, or we restructure the company into an equal partnership with full transparency, independent board oversight, and shared governance. Peter looked like he might choke on his own spit. You're extorting us. I tilted my head slightly. No, I'm offering you a choice. My father's hands were clenched into fists on the table, his knuckles stark, white against the wood. My mother stared at me as if seeing a stranger, and maybe she was, because the woman sitting across from them now wasn't the desperate daughter longing for approval. She was the heir Grandma Margaret had always believed I could be. The storm they never saw coming, and now couldn't outrun. They thought they had written the ending to this story. They were wrong, and I intended to show them just how wrong. The tension in the conference room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. My father sat rigid in his chair, his jaw working silently as he stared at the documents spread before him. Vanessa flipped through them furiously, each turn of the page sharper, angrier than the last. Peter sat back, arms crossed, his mouth a thin, displeased line. Walter Simmons cleared his throat again, breaking the silence. From a legal standpoint, he said carefully, Claire's proposal is fair, equitable, and fully enforceable. My mother's voice cracked the fragile stillness. Claire, she said, her voice brittle, why? Why didn't you tell us? Why all this secrecy? I looked at her, really looked, and for the first time I wasn't a child begging to be loved. I was a woman, standing fully in her own power. Because you never asked, I said simply. Because you never cared enough to wonder if I had anything to say, anything worth hearing. A flicker of hurt crossed her face, quickly masked, but not quickly enough. Walter pushed a revised agreement across the table. If you choose to accept Claire's terms, Anderson Financial Group will transition to a dual ownership model. Claire and Vanessa will hold equal voting rights. An independent board member will be appointed to break any deadlocks. The Anderson building will remain Claire's sole property, and the company will lease the space from her at market rate, unless renegotiated otherwise. Vanessa slammed the folder shut. This is a hostage situation, she hissed. No, I said quietly, rising to my feet, feeling the old fear slew off me like a dead skin. This is balance, something this family hasn't seen in decades. Peter leaned forward, his voice tight. You're going to ruin everything out of spite. I met his glare without flinching. No, I'm going to save what's left by refusing to let you destroy it in your own image. My father stood too now, towering over the table. For a moment, I saw the man he used to be, proud, commanding, the kind of man who built something from nothing, but also the kind of man who forgot that real strength wasn't about domination. It was about legacy, about honor. This isn't what Margaret wanted, he said stiffly. Isn't it? I countered, lifting Grandma's handwritten letter from my folder, sliding it across to Walter. She planned this years ago, when she realized that loyalty meant nothing if it wasn't reciprocated. Walter read quickly, then nodded once, solemnly. Margaret was very clear in her intentions. The silence that followed was long, ugly, necessary. Finally, Vanessa slumped back into her chair. Exhaustion and fury etched deep into her face. Fine, she spat. We'll play your little partnership game. It's not a game, I said softly, gathering my papers. It's the future, whether you like it or not. Walter nodded briskly. We can have the formal contracts ready for signatures by Friday. My parents exchanged a long look, one full of unspoken regrets, old wounds, and grudging acceptance. Slowly they nodded. It was done. Not with the applause Vanessa had imagined for herself. Not with the triumphant celebrations my parents had prepared, but with the quiet, irreversible shifting of tectonic plates beneath their carefully constructed world. I walked out of the conference room that afternoon, the weight of a lifetime's worth of longing and disappointment falling away with every step, lighter, freer, stronger than I had ever been allowed to be. The glass doors swung shut behind me, sealing them inside the world they had built, a world that, from now on, they would have to share with the daughter they had tried so hard to forget. Outside, the Richmond sky was clearing, the clouds thinning to reveal slashes of gold and pink across the horizon. A different kind of inheritance, one no amount of money or power could ever match. Freedom, respect, self-worth. And as I walked into the fading light, the key to my future, to my true legacy, nestled safely in my pocket, I realized that Grandma Margaret hadn't just saved the building, she had saved me. The days that followed moved in a strange kind of peace, not the peace that comes from resolution, but the kind that settles in when you finally stop fighting battles that were never yours to win. Anderson Financial Group began its slow, awkward transition into true, shared leadership. Contracts were signed, procedures were restructured, meetings that once would have excluded me now required my voice at the table. Vanessa remained cold, professional, distant, but she no longer dismissed me with the casual arrogance of old. Peter, too, kept his distance, his ambitions checked by the new order Grandma Margaret had ensured. My parents, well, some things healed slowly, if at all. My mother tried in her way, reaching out with tentative brunch invitations and texts filled with small talk. My father stayed mostly silent, his pride too deep, too brittle to bend so soon. I answered politely, distantly, setting boundaries not with anger, but with the quiet certainty that I was no longer the child desperate for scraps of affection. I focused instead on my own life, on the building that now belonged to me, a towering reminder that legacies are not gifts, they are earned, claimed, protected. I spent weekends at the Anderson Building, walking its marble halls, restoring old offices to their former glory, breathing life back into a place that had once been the beating heart of our family's dreams. I hired architects to preserve its historical charm while modernizing the essentials. I leased out unused floors to small businesses, young entrepreneurs who, like me, knew what it meant to build from nothing but grit and vision. Each morning, when I unlocked the front doors and stepped inside, I felt it, the pulse of possibility, the echo of all the dreams Grandma Margaret must have carried when she first laid the foundation stones with her own 2 hands. Sometimes I would pause in the grand lobby, look up at the old brass chandelier and whisper a silent thank you for her faith, her love, her fierce refusal to let me be erased. James remained my steadfast ally, cheering me on with quiet pride, celebrating small victories, reminding me on the hard days that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the steady, stubborn choice to keep showing up. It wasn't perfect. There were days when the loneliness crept in, when memories of what could have been if my family had chosen differently haunted the edges of my mind. But those moments grew fewer, weaker, drowned out by the life I was building for myself. One Saturday evening, standing alone on the rooftop of the Anderson building, watching the sun dip below the Richmond skyline, painting the world in shades of molten gold, I realized something profound. I hadn't just inherited property or power or position. I had inherited freedom. The freedom to define myself, to stand without apology, to shape my own legacy, not in reaction to the family that tried to diminish me, but because of the woman I had chosen to become. Grandma Margaret had seen that potential, and through her final, brilliant act of love, she had handed me the tools to uncover it. As the wind stirred around me, lifting my hair and carrying with it the scent of the city, old brick, new asphalt, blooming dogwoods, I smiled to myself. Small at first, then wider, brighter, the kind of smile that came from deep within, from places no betrayal could touch. This wasn't the ending they had written for me. This was my beginning, and I was just getting started.